If this story touched your heart and you love animals, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the winter of 2020, in the small town of Elm Hollow, Wisconsin, winter arrived with sudden force. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, covering roofs, streets, and fields under a heavy, wet blanket. The world looked muted, soundless, wrapped tightly in white silence. The air was thick with cold, each breath slicing sharply through the lungs. Claire, a retired schoolteacher, lived at the edge of town in a small, weathered house tucked against the forest's first rise. Her life was simple, quiet, shaped by steady routines and the changing seasons. Her only constant companion was Brody, a large golden retriever with gentle eyes and a calm spirit. He moved through the world with the patient grace of one who had seen many winters and trusted the rhythm of the earth more than the frantic pace of people. That day, as the snow drifted in slow, lazy spirals from a heavy gray sky, Claire buttoned her thick coat and pulled on her boots. Brody waited at the door, his tail wagging once, then falling still. Together they stepped into the whiteness, the snow crunching softly underfoot. The road was barely visible, swallowed by snowdrifts. Trees loomed like dark ghosts, their bare branches bending under the weight of ice. It wasn't a morning for long walks, but Claire felt a pull to move, to breathe the sharp, clean air despite the cold that bit into her skin. Brody was different that morning. His head was low, his nose working furiously through the layers of scent the snow tried to smother. His steps were quicker, more urgent. Claire noticed, frowning slightly. Usually he matched her slow, careful pace. She tugged her scarf tighter around her neck and turned to call him back. But before she could, Brody froze. His entire body stiffened, ears pricked, muscles tense beneath his thick fur. For a heartbeat, everything held still. The snow, the trees, the very air around them. Then, without warning, Brody bolted off the trail, plunging into the deeper snow toward the dark edge of the woods. Claire gasped and hurried after him, stumbling through the drifts. Her heart pounded, not from the effort, but from the sudden certainty that something was wrong. Ahead, Brody disappeared into a dip in the land, a narrow ravine hidden by the snowfall. Claire followed, slipping and sliding, her hands raw from the cold. At the bottom of the ravine, Brody stood motionless, his body blocking something small and shivering half buried in the snow. Claire's breath caught painfully in her chest. There, almost invisible against the white, was a tiny, motionless kitten. And Brody, her steadfast, gentle Brody, had found him. Claire moved carefully through the deep snow, her boots sinking past her ankles with each step. The cold clung to her, numbing her fingers even inside her gloves. Ahead, Brody had stopped, his golden fur dusted with white, almost blending into the endless expanse of snow. His posture was rigid but gentle, his body low to the ground. As Claire drew closer, she saw it. A tiny hollow in the snow, sheltered slightly by a bend in the land, where something small and gray lay curled. For a terrifying moment, she thought it was already too late. The little bundle barely moved, its fur clumped with ice, its body so still it seemed carved from frost itself. A kitten. So small, it barely seemed real. Its paws were tucked tightly under its body, its eyes squeezed shut against the cold. Claire knelt beside the hollow, feeling the wetness of the snow soak through the knees of her jeans. She reached out carefully but stopped herself. Her hands were too cold, too clumsy. She could hurt it without meaning to. Brody moved before she could. With infinite care, he lay down beside the kitten, curling his body protectively around it. His thick fur created a wall against the wind, his body heat seeping slowly into the frozen little frame. He nudged the kitten closer with his muzzle, then placed one massive paw gently over the trembling body, as if to anchor it to life. His other paw brushed lightly against the kitten's head, and he began to lick its tiny face with deliberate strokes, clearing away the ice. Claire watched, her throat tightening. This wasn't instinct. This was something more. Brody knew. He understood. She pulled out her phone, her fingers stiff and clumsy, and tried to dial the local rescue service. The screen flickered. No signal. She tried again. Still nothing. The blizzard had knocked out the lines. Even if she could reach someone, help wouldn't come fast enough. Claire looked up at the sky. Snow fell thicker now, heavy and relentless, reducing the world to a whirling, suffocating whiteness. The path home was already nearly invisible. Turning back quickly with Brody and the kitten wasn't an option. They would have to stay. She pulled her scarf higher over her mouth and nose and crouched lower into the hollow, letting the snow pile around them for shelter. She untied her thick woolen coat and draped it across Brody and the kitten, sacrificing her own warmth to create a pocket of heat around the two. The kitten stirred slightly under the weight of the coat, a faint twitch of its ear, a flicker of breath. Claire dared to hope. She pulled Brody closer with soft words he didn't need to hear to understand. He pressed in tighter against the kitten, his breathing steady and deep. Minutes blurred into hours. Claire lost all sense of time, measuring it only by the kitten's breathing, by the slow rise and fall of Brody's chest, by the numbness creeping steadily into her own body. The snow cocooned them, muffling everything. In that small hollow, in the endless field of white, 3 fragile lives huddled together, clinging to the thread of warmth they had stitched between them. Claire kept her eyes open, forcing herself to stay awake. She knew that if she let herself drift, it could be the end. For her, for the kitten, even for Brody. She thought about how easy it would have been to miss the tiny life buried under the snow, about how most would have passed by without knowing, about how sometimes salvation didn't come from plans or strength, but from something quieter, attention, care, the refusal to leave another soul alone. Brody shifted slightly, adjusting the kitten closer to his chest. The little one let out a tiny, almost imperceptible mewl. Claire let out a shaky breath, tears freezing on her lashes. They would stay. They would wait. They would not give up. Above them, the snow kept falling, sealing them into their small, defiant shelter. A single point of warmth in an endless, frozen world. Claire fumbled through the stiff fabric of her coat until she found the old woolen blanket tucked deep inside her satchel. She had carried it for years, a habit left over from her hiking days, when weather in Wisconsin could turn treacherous in an instant. She unfolded it with numb fingers and draped it carefully over Brody and the kitten. Brody did not move. He simply adjusted slightly to better shield the fragile body pressed against him. His breathing was slow and deep, the steady rhythm of a dog who understood his role and accepted it without hesitation. The blanket settled heavily over him, trapping what little warmth they had between its frayed folds. The kitten trembled beneath the layers. Tiny spasms ran through its damp, frail body. Sometimes it whimpered, small, broken sounds that barely pierced the thick silence around them. Other times it lay frighteningly still, and Claire found herself leaning closer, straining to see the faint rise and fall of its chest. She stayed by their side, afraid to move too much, afraid to disturb the fragile balance they had created. Her own body was beginning to betray her, fingers stiff, toes numb, the ache of cold burrowing deep into her bones. Every breath she took seared her lungs with icy sharpness. Above them, the snow continued to fall. Thick, heavy flakes blurred the world into a uniform white, burying the trail they had come from and erasing any landmarks. The hollow where they huddled felt like a tiny island adrift in a frozen sea, isolated and unseen. Time lost its meaning. Minutes stretched impossibly long, ticking by with the slow, dragging weight of exhaustion and cold. Claire pressed her hand gently against Brody's side, feeling the faint heat radiating through the blanket. She whispered to him. Soft, broken words carried more by hope than sound. Not to encourage him, not even to encourage the kitten, but to anchor herself against the rising tide of fear. She knew the kitten's life balanced on the thinnest of threads. Every hour spent exposed to the cold was another hour closer to losing that tiny heartbeat. Claire could feel the pressure of helplessness building inside her, a gnawing, silent panic. But Brody remained steadfast. His body curled tighter around the kitten, his head low and still. His loyalty was absolute. A quiet, enduring thing that asked for nothing and gave everything. The wind picked up in bursts, rattling through the bare branches overhead. Claire hunched lower, pulling the edges of her coat tighter, shielding the little shelter they had built together. She tried not to think about how far they were from home, about how alone they were, about how easily the woods could forget they were even there. Instead, she focused on the faint warmth beneath her palm, on the slow, stubborn beat of life nestled against Brody's chest. She told herself they would make it. They had to. Because sometimes survival wasn't about strength or speed. Sometimes it was about waiting, about enduring, about refusing to let go. And in that quiet, frozen clearing, Claire, Brody, and a trembling scrap of life waited together, holding on to a hope as fragile and vital as breath itself. When the blizzard finally eased and the crackling of a faint signal returned to her phone, Claire managed to call her neighbor. Her voice trembled as she explained their situation, the words tumbling out in short, urgent bursts. The neighbor, a retired mechanic named Harold, promised he would come as soon as he could. Half an hour later, the low rumble of his old four-wheel drive truck broke through the stillness of the ravine. Claire waved her arms weakly to guide him, her body stiff with cold. Harold and his teenage son trudged through the snow, carrying a thick blanket between them. Together they helped Claire to her feet and carefully lifted Brody and the small trembling bundle wrapped in wool onto the back seat of the truck. Brody refused to leave the kitten even for a moment. He climbed into the truck bed, curling his large frame around the tiny life he had protected for so long. The drive home was slow and careful. The roads were still slick, and snowbanks rose like frozen waves on either side of the narrow path. Inside the cab, the heater groaned, fighting to fill the air with warmth. Claire watched Brody from the corner of her eye, watched the way he shielded the kitten with his body, his paws forming a careful barrier, his nose nudging the kitten gently when it shivered. Back at the house, Harold helped Claire inside while his son carried the supplies. Claire quickly cleared a spot in front of the fireplace, layering thick quilts and old comforters over the rug. She lit the fire with shaking hands, feeding it until the flames grew strong and steady. Brody settled himself on the blankets without hesitation, still cradling the kitten against his chest. Claire knelt beside them, gently peeling away the wet wool that clung to the kitten's fur. She wrapped the little body in a fresh towel, warming it between her palms before reaching for the small bottle of milk she kept for emergencies. The kitten stirred weakly, its tiny mouth opening in a feeble mew. Claire used a pipette to offer a few drops of warm milk. At first, the kitten barely responded, but after a few minutes, it latched on, drawing in the life it so desperately needed. Brody watched the process with unwavering attention, his head low, his dark eyes filled with quiet urgency. Only when Claire tucked the kitten into a dry blanket, placed carefully beside him, and smoothed the edges over its fragile body, did Brody allow himself to relax. He let out a long, slow breath and lowered his head onto the folded quilts. His body curled protectively around the kitten one last time before sleep finally claimed him. The fire crackled, casting a soft orange glow across the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, there was warmth, breath, and the steady promise of survival. Together, they had made it home. Weeks slipped by, and the little kitten survived. Claire named him Snoops, for his smoky gray coat that seemed spun from drifting snow and mist. Snoops grew stronger quickly, his legs gaining coordination, his tiny heart finding rhythm. He became inseparable from Brody, shadowing him from room to room, curling beneath his broad chest when frightened by a sudden noise or a heavy footstep. Brody accepted it all with infinite patience. He endured the playful nips at his ears, the daring leaps onto his back, and the clumsy attempts to scale his large, warm body. He moved carefully, always aware of the small life clinging to him, adjusting his steps to protect him. Claire often caught herself smiling as she watched them together. In Brody's steady presence and Snoop's unbreakable trust, she saw something rare, a bond born not of chance, but of choice. If Brody had not found him, if he had not stayed, the thought was too heavy to finish. Instead, she focused on what was in front of her, a playful kitten growing into a brave young cat, and a dog who never once let him out of his gentle, watchful care. By the time spring came, the heavy snows of Elm Hollow had melted into memory. The fields once buried in white were now dressed in soft green, and the streams, swollen with melted ice, murmured quietly along their banks. The air smelled of damp earth and new life. One afternoon, Claire, Brody, and Snoop's returned to the old ravine. The place looked different without the weight of winter. Open, breathing, alive. Brody paused at the edge, lifting his nose to the breeze, his body still, as if remembering something carried in the scent. Claire stood behind him, one hand resting lightly on his back. Snoop's, larger now but still slight compared to Brody, padded forward cautiously. He sniffed at the grass, his tail twitching with curiosity. He seemed to sense something lingering in the soil, something deeper than just the passage of time. Brody looked back at Claire for a moment, then turned his gaze outward again, standing firm, not searching, not waiting, simply being. Sometimes salvation did not begin with shouts or grand gestures. Sometimes it was born from something smaller, the quiet sharing of warmth, the simple choice to stay beside someone who needed you. Brody never knew he had done something extraordinary. He had only followed what was already stitched into his soul, to protect, to endure, to give without expectation. And in that silent choice, 2 lives had been changed forever.